Alright, so it seems that the event that I've tried to connect to does not work. I'll get that working in a later class. If you go to the channel right now, it should be live. I just got a notification, so I'm trying to be fancy, but this is what it gets me. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the introduction to Xcode, Swift, and essentially how to make your first iOS app. Albeit very simple, but we're going to make one, kind of show you the really cool tools and why Xcode is the greatest IDE in the land. Do you have a question? No. Okay, just make sure. All right, so when you start a new project in Xcode, this is the interface that you'll see. Hopefully you see something similar. On the left-hand side, we have all the different starter applications that we can choose from. So right now we're in iOS, and we have all these different ones that we can start out with, and Xcode will kind of build this up for us. So if you want a game, it'll include things probably like Sprite Kit. We can have frameworks and libraries. So if you want to make your own framework and put it out in the world for people to use, open source or whatever, this is where you'd start. It creates the compiler script and a bunch of basic classes, and then also test cases too. So hopefully you guys are starting to get into unit testing and that sort of thing. And then finally we have Cocoa Touch Static Library, which is a little bit different than a framework. WatchOS, very similar. We can start with making WatchOS or OS apps. If you just start with this and just play around with it, you'll see kind of how that works. tvOS, very similar. OS 10, and you just create a command line tool, etc., etc. So we'll just stick with this one, and then we'll also create a single view application. So if you're following along, select that one, hit the next button, and it's going to ask you, what do you want to call this application? You can change this name later. It's sometimes a little tricky. Every now and then Xcode has a few bugs with renaming your project. This is not the final name, this is just the project name, so you really don't need to change it, but we're going to call this first. And organization name, Electronic Armory, is fine. Organization identifier, this is important. Android has the same concept, but this is going to be a unique identifier for your application. We call this the application bundle or the bundle ID, and this is unique because it is going to be reverse DNS of perhaps your website. Though if you don't have a website, just use your name and maybe .com or similar. So in this example, we do have a website, and we just type in com.electronicarmory.com. If you want to just use your name, just type in com.mikez or whatever it happens to be. Your language as a default might be selected to Objective-C. Switch it to Swift starting off. And this is the language that we're going to use. You can mix Swift and Objective-C in one project. So if you do select Swift but you have some Objective-C files you want to bring over, that's okay as well. You can do that. Swift and Objective-C go hand in hand. They work really, really well together. There's a little bit of finagling you got to do, but they do work well together. And then under devices, Universal is kind of the default that we want to stick with because that'll allow us to export our application out to iPhone and Android. No, not that kind of universal. iPhone and iPad, and I'll show you in this class how to build one app that rules them all, right? So for this one, we'll select universal. If for some reason, if you really had a good reason to only limit it to iPhone or iPad, you would select it here, and you can always change this later. I'll show you where that happens to be. For these checkboxes, it says use core data. Core data is our embedded SQLite, or you can actually, it doesn't have to be SQLite, but it's essentially our database that's embedded within our iOS application. So you can run queries against it using SQL, but actually it's more of an object notation. So you use code rather than the error-prone SQL code that is in a string that's not compiler checked. It's not type checked. It's not really checked at all. So if you have a code in your SQL string, or your query string, you don't realize that until runtime. And so by building it with code, this works really, really well in terms of developing very quickly and efficiently and without too many errors, at least. At least it'll run. It won't. I don't know what it gets back is about Same. You can also include unit tests, and this will build out a basic structure for you. For unit tests, it just fills out the functions, the setup, and then the teardown, and it's up to you to test your own code. And then we also have something that's fairly new in Xcode and iOS development, include UI tests. And this is really cool because we can actually test the UI by having basically a bot go through the interface and say, I want to select this button, or I want to type this text into the text field. I'm going to do that 100 times, or 100 times in a row, or I'm going to have some random string, or I'm going to have some random alphanumeric or numeric value, or all that fun stuff, right? There's a joke. It's like a QA engineer walks into a bar, right, and he orders a beer, and he orders a monkey, and he orders 5, like the number 5, and he's ordering all these weird things and all these different combinations of things, and it's not that funny when I say it, but you got to read it. But that's the joke, is you're testing every single kind of input that you could possibly input, and hopefully your application doesn't break. So that's what unit tests and the UI tests will solve for you. Unit tests, if you're not familiar, tests little bits of code, while the UI tests actually tests your, it's more of an end-to-end testing. It'll test your application as a whole, or maybe 1 or 2 screens if you want. So I'm going to hit enter on that one. I am going to go to my development folder, and oh, okay, so I don't, this is my other one. Yeah, let's just stick it in there. Okay, so this is Xcode. Welcome to Xcode. This is the first screen that you'll see when you start a application just like I did. On the left-hand side, this is where we have our code files. This is our Explorer, our File Explorer. You can show and get rid of this by hitting Command 1. Or I'm sorry, Command 1 will show it, Command 0 will hide it. So Command 0, Command 1 shows it. And you want to get really comfortable with these shortcut keyboard or these keyboard shortcuts, because you'll want to show and hide these different panels without having to go over with your mouse and select these. You can also accomplish the same thing with these buttons up in the top right hand corner. Sorry, I can't make that interface bigger, but showing and hiding the left nav will do that whole entire window, the right nav, and then we have a bottom one that's not being shown, and this is where your console and output will be. If you have watchers for your variables, you'll see them in this window. Here's your console. We'll get to that in a second. And so Command-Shift-Y will hide that, and Option-Command-0 will hide the right one. And I'll call these out so you get familiar with it. But do try to learn those if you don't remember by me just throwing these at you. No worries. I do believe they're all in the, let's see, window, or let's see, where are they? View. Yeah, view. So navigators, yeah, sorry. So under the View Navigators menu, you can see all the shortcuts. So Show Project Navigator, that's the one where you're seeing that on the left. We have other ones under here, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, etc. Those will show your class hierarchy, so you might be familiar with something that's similar to this. We have a search. This is a project, a project-wide search. Number 4, if you hit Command 4, this goes to our errors and warnings, and hopefully, or maybe not hopefully, but I will probably type in an error and try to compile it. You'll see those errors and issues in there. Number 5 are our unit tests. If a test fails, you'll see it there. Number 6, we'll see our stack trace, so all of the different functions and methods that we dive into, and different threads as well. Number 7 is all of our breakpoints. We don't have it at the moment. And then number 8, I believe, is just a project. All my comments. Or yeah, actually, I don't know what that window does. Never use it. But anyway, so here's our first initial file that we have open. And this is actually the project properties. This is where we can change things on a project-wide basis. And so starting from the top, we have our bundle identifier that we can change. We can type that in. We have our version number, our build number, and if we have a team, meaning if we have our ADC or Apple Developer Account login, what we can do is we can add that here. And so actually this email address that I've added has a number of groups associated with it. I'm going to select my personal. You should probably only have one. And if you don't see that, what you can do is go into Preferences and add yours here. Okay, so that's my personal email. I don't have my account on there. I use my company email for my actual email. So this is a free account, so this should be what you all see. Next we have the deployment target. We can deploy way down to iOS 6, meaning we support everything iOS 6 and above. And so if I kept it at 9.3, you would have to have the latest and greatest iOS version in order to run my application that I'm about to create. So we usually don't keep this at the latest, meaning 9.3. What I do like to do is support one version back. And you can look this up on the internet, and I'll show this at a later class. But you can look at the penetration rate of each iOS application, or excuse me, each iOS version. So in other words, you can see that versions before 8.0 have about a 5% market share, maybe a little bit higher than that, maybe a 6 or 7% market share. Whereas 8 and above, if you support 8 and above, you can cover about 94% of the devices that are out there. Compare that to Android, where it's a little bit better now, but like 2 years ago, maybe even as short as last year, there's Android 2.0 basically, 2.2, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and then basically nobody uses 3, and then there was 4, and then 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and then 5 and 6. If you wanted to support everything 4.0 and above, you would only cover about 80% of the devices. And 4.0 was an operating system that was about 4 years old, something like that. So Android operating systems severely lag behind the latest and greatest. And one of the reasons is because every different Android hardware, piece of hardware, they have their own configuration, right? They have their own camera setup. The hardware is different. And so if you want to update the operating system, you have to say, okay, for the, I can't name any generics off the top of my head, but if you went to like Cricket or some of the other lower end dealers for the telecoms, and you got just a generic phone, up until a couple of years ago, you might have gotten Android 2.3 on your phone, which is a little ridiculous. And again, that's like a 6-year-old operating system. The reason is, again, you would have to update the operating system for every single one of those devices, and that takes energy in terms of developer time, what have you. And the telecoms, Verizon, AT&T, they're all guilty of this. They don't want to update their operating system because they would just rather have you buy a new phone because they make more money on that. So there's really no incentive for them to update your Android operating system for you. Some of them do. If you want to buy, I know Google and the Nexus phones are really, really good about it. I think Samsung's pretty good about updating their phone operating system. So if you do have like a Nexus, what are they, 6, 8, 7, whatever they are these days. If you have a Samsung Galaxy, whatever, you're pretty good up for maybe a couple operating systems. Apple, you can have a 5-year-old iOS device and still run the latest operating system. So the fragmentation is a lot less. So that was a long-winded explanation of that one text field, but essentially I support one version back in my own applications. If you really want to try to cover everybody for some reason, you can go back to like 7.1, which still has the same look and feel of iOS as it currently looks today. There's just some APIs that you won't have access to, and Xcode will let you know. So you can always try to fall that back to 7.1 and see if you get any error warnings on particular APIs. But that would be why if you do run into issues like that. Okay, so devices, we already covered that. We're going to select universal. The main interface, this is just a list of all of our storyboards, and we'll go over storyboards here in a second. But if you have multiple storyboards, you can select different versions of that to be kind of the entry point into your application. Device orientation, these are the orientations that we are going to support. Portrait, left, landscape, left and right. I'm going to uncheck these, so basically only portrait or up and down is selected. You can also support, and some applications do, upside down, meaning the home button is at the top, right? And some applications do that, but not a lot. I don't know why you wouldn't, but I guess if you always wanted to know where your home button is, if it's make sure it's oriented to the bottom. That's just what I see. But anyway, actually this would be good if you want to have like your charging cable sticking straight up and still have your iPhone propped up against something. I've wanted to do that many times, and whatever application I'm using doesn't support that. So maybe turn that on by default. It depends on what you're doing. The status bar, light or not, it's just the top bar, what that looks like. And I'm going to stop right there because we'll get into the other stuff later. Okay, so what is a storyboard? If you click on the main.storyboard here on the left, you'll see a box, an empty box. Well, that's wonderful, right? If you hit Command R to compile our application and run it, you'll see our simulator pop up, and hopefully if you don't have the simulator pop up, maybe if you have your iPhone plugged in, just select the different devices down here. And if it doesn't switch to it immediately, you could always go to the simulator here, pop it up, and it's absolutely gargantuous. So I'm going to go to Window, Scale, and maybe scale that down to about 50%, or hit Command 3. And if you're running the simulator for the first time, this actually switched to a different simulator. It has to essentially install the operating system or unpackage it or whatever it does initially. Okay, so there's our application. Congratulations, you're now an iOS developer. But obviously you want to add stuff to this. This is the running application, but it's showing this. This is our UI. Now, if you remember your keyboard shortcuts, Option Command 0 will show our inspector on the side, or you can hit this little button on the right to show this. If you go down to this window here, they kind of hide it in the corner. Hopefully you guys can see that in the back. If not, sit forward next time. This will have all of our UI widgets and other elements that we can add. The tops are actually classes and other things like that, but if you do scroll down, we have a label, a button, a segmented control, a text field, a slider, all these things that you're probably used to if you've ever used iOS before. And so to start developing our interface, we simply click and drag onto the screen, and you can see we have some nice helpful little guidelines here. We're going to make, do like a little finance calculator. So I'm going to say enter the initial principal. How do you spell principal? Is that how you spell principal? I don't know if it's principal or with an L. Forgive my spelling on the fly here. I'm going to drag in a text box, and I'm going to line that up with this, kind of move it there, and actually I'm going to move this down so that this blue line that goes across, you can see that's a guide that's telling you don't put anything above this. This is the top point that you want to put this, because we have our status bar up here, and usually that's where the time goes, your Wi-Fi connection, etc. So I'm going to move this down to align with that. I'm going to stretch this out to the edge, so it shows me where the edge is there. So that's my initial principal, and then we have, of course, an interest rate, right? So I'm just going to call it interest. And recenter that on the left margin. Add a text box. Pretty easy so far, right? Drag that over. Okay, and then obviously we're going to need a place for our combined, when you make interest over a year, what price that, or what's the final value of that. So I'm going to create a label for that. I could create a text box and either make that non-editable or make it editable if you wanted to change these different values. But I'm just going to make it a label for right now. Okay, and then maybe let's add a button, because you could do this automatically as you type, but I'm going to add in a button to just say calculate. All right, so there's our interface, pretty simple, but this will be the foundation for almost everything that you do from here on out. All these buttons work in very similar ways than the text fields and the labels, which you'll see in a second. And we'll cover them in a later class, but this will be sufficient for our purposes. All right, so what we do is we need a controller class or controller file to match up with this view. So this is our view. We need a controller, and this is going to be part of our model view controller. And you might be asking, where's our model? Well, our model is just data. We don't currently have that at the moment. But Xcode has already set this up for us, and it's under the view controller. This is just a generic class. It is of type UI view controller. So this is how we do inheritance in Swift. So just colon and then whatever the parent class is called. So this is our actual class here. And what I can do is I can rename this, though the refactor tools don't quite work as well as in Swift as they do in Objective-C. So I'm just going to keep this as view controller for right now. If I wanted to change this name, there's a few places I'll have to do that, but or maybe they fixed it. I don't think they fixed it. Well, let's give it a shot. Nope. Yep. Okay. Didn't work. So I was right. So Xcode can only refactor C and Objective-C code. Maybe they fixed that in 8. I'll have to get Xcode 8 here in this next class. All right. So here's our class that we kind of went over this syntax last class. We have import UI kit. So now we are going to need the classes that are contained in the module UI kit. I'll show you these in a second. Class view controller, it inherits from UI view controller. UI view controller is again in our UI kit module, so that's where that gets that. We have this view did load. This is meaning that this class or the view that this controller is controlling, it loaded, or it started, maybe another name for it. And it's a function, as you can see by the keyword func. And you might see this override keyword, and this is just saying that UI view controller, the parent class, has this as a method within it, and we're overriding that. And this is almost required. I mean, you always have a view did load, whether you override it or not. And then we call super.viewDidLoad to initialize the parent class's view controller, or I'm sorry, the view in the view controller. Before we do any additional editing in ours. I'll show you this in a second. The next one is kind of interesting, and especially if you come from a Java world, you might not have seen this before. Did receive memory warning. All right, so these devices have a very limited amount of memory. Back in the day when the iPhone 1 and the 3G, the 3GS came out, your application had megabytes to play with. Maybe 30 megabytes, maybe 60 megabytes. It depended on the operating system at the time. It depended on the exact hardware, but you had megabytes to play with. And so if you were loading in usually more than one image, your application would crash because your application would run out of memory. We would receive this method. This method would get called on this view controller when that happened. And if it happened, you can clear out any variables that you had in memory, such as image data or any other large pieces of data. You could throw that out and then hopefully reload that again. But at least you got a warning that something was about to happen. And you can trigger this in the simulator, by the way. If you go back to the simulator, go to hardware, and simulate memory warning. So if you're doing a really intense application, you might want to test this. This is a great way to test how that code runs. If you're running the simulator on your computer, I should say, your computer has 6 gigs, 4 gigs, 8 gigs. I think mine has 16 gigs. You'll never run out of memory. I shouldn't say never, but it's really hard to run out of memory on an iOS app with 16 gigs of memory. So you'll never see this warning in normal testing. So that's why I always test on a device. And as I was talking to student before, we want to use older devices that are slower, have low memory, so that we can test those. So yeah, Jordan, let me know what you end up doing with that, because I'll be curious. All right, that's enough for the view controller. Now, you might say, how do I connect my view controller to this view? It's already connected. If you click on the title bar up here, let me reduce this a little bit. Here on the right-hand side in our inspector window in the navigation, we have all these different buttons at the top. These kind of act as tabs. And if you click on the identifier, or the identity inspector, okay, so it'll say custom class UI button because I still have my button selected. So make sure you click several times in that title bar until you see the correct object, or in this case class, being displayed. And so this is showing that my ViewController is being the class that is associated with this view. Okay, and again, Xcode set this all up for me, but I'll show you how to add one here in a second. All right, so that's just the basics of it. If we go ahead and run this, yes, stop the current instance and rerun this. You don't have to save it explicitly, it'll just save when you run it. All right, so this is our application, and you can see that we can click within our text field here, and our keyboard shows up. We can go to the next one, and our keyboard shows up. We can start typing whatever it suggests. But if you notice, between our interface and our actual simulator, our button has disappeared because it's way off to the right. So let me introduce you to how we do auto sizing in iOS. Right now it's going to be an absolute position wherever I put those buttons. So I put the buttons way off to the right, and so it's getting cut off. But we want to make sure that it's anchored to that right-hand side of the screen. And this is similar to CSS, where you're doing like a float right, or maybe a right margin 0, or something of that nature. All right, so to do that same thing, we hold down the Control key and we left click and drag from our button to the right-hand side of our window here, or our view, and release. And it'll pop up this nice little contextual menu. And the option that we want to select is trailing space to container margin. And what that means in plain English is the trailing, or the ending space, namely the space on the right-hand side, to container margin. So the container is our view, our entire box view. And what this is essentially saying is I want to lock whatever space is in between, in that little gutter there on the right. I want to lock that down. Okay? And so you'll see that now our calculate button is adjusted to our right, and it's going to stay, I don't know how far that is, let's say 5 pixels, maybe 10 is probably more likely. But it's red, and red is bad, right? So what have we done to our beautiful view that was once pristine? Well, it's now saying that, well, you told me to be all the way to the right, but you didn't tell me how to be, vertical-wise where to be. And how do I know that it's asking that? Well, just because of experience. But you can also go into this little red arrow. If you click on that, it'll tell you everything that's wrong with these constraints that we've added. And so it's saying needs constraint for Y position. So that's the up and down position. So if you click on that, it'll show you the button that this is affecting. And you can lock it to the top of the screen, or you can be relative to other objects. And this is what I like to do, is be relative to other objects, because as I move these text fields around, I want this button to always be below it. So Control click and drag from your button to your text field, and again it'll open up the same contextual menu but with different options. And so what I want to do is vertical spacing, that vertical spacing between my button and that object that I just selected, or that UI element that I selected. Okay, and now you can see this, well, maybe you can't, but there's kind of this little strut objects, kind of like an I-beam almost, or some kind of support, showing that I'm going to push against this object here, but it's still red. And so looking at our constraints, what is missing? Well, there's a lot of things that are missing, and this is a good introduction to auto sizing, because we have to set up the all the constraints for every single UI element. Or we can select these objects and then go down to, I think it's this one. No, the other one. Sorry. So I don't know if you can see that way in the back. It is a triangle with 2 vertical lines and kind of a cat and whiskers type graph, if you're familiar with those. If you click on that, you can actually do add missing constraints. And what that'll do, if you do the bottom one, by the way, it's all views, You can see this kind of grayed out, and I'm sorry if you can't see that in the back. All views in ViewController, you can add the missing constraints there, and it'll try to do a best guess of it. Or you can just do the one that's currently selected. So if I do the one that's currently selected, you'll see that Xcode actually adds those constraints for me. So that's pretty cool, right? But we still have to add a couple other ones. And so what I'll do is I'll just add the missing constraints for the rest of everyone. Hit Control or Command R. I think I have another version of the simulator running. Yeah.
Is this Xcode 7?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is 8 different?
8's different.
Ah, okay. My bad. I'll do in the next class in 8. Okay, so you can see that Xcode did a really poor job in our auto resizing here, and that's okay. We'll just switch back, and probably what it didn't do was assign it to the left-hand side. So click on our labels here. Do leading edge instead of trailing. Same thing with the interest label, leading edge. And then I'm going to do it between these two. Actually, it looks like the horizontal spacing is already set up for me. So let's go ahead and test that out. Instead of compiling it every time, let's see. They have a, they usually don't do this, but I'll find that later. Okay, so this is this is really messed up. So what it probably did is set a constant width for these, and what you can do is you can go back to the structure of it, and in the text field, actually under the constraints, if you go through these, yeah, this one, you can delete that one, and delete that one. Yeah, so welcome to auto sizing. Hopefully it's better in 8, but what it was, I think what it was doing was it was trying to make those text fields a constant width, and we don't want that. We want it to resize appropriately. Okay, that didn't do it either. So this is another thing that I like to do. Highlight everything, or actually just go in here. You can reset restraints. And I'm just going to do this manually. Okay, so leading edge. No, I already messed up. I don't want to center that. Okay, so the horizontal spacing between this one, and then for this one, all you have to do is just the right trailing edge, horizontal spacing, leading edge, and vertical spacing, as well as vertical spacing here, and let's do vertical spacing here. Let's see if that's close enough. It's still saying it's red, but I think that's okay for right now. Wow, okay, let me close that real quick. When in doubt, I usually just start over because this can get a little bit confusing. Okay, so it needs an X position. What I'm going to do is just connect it here and just do center horizontally in container. Needs an X position. I thought I already set that up to trailing edge. Y position for this one. Vertical spacing to layout. Needs Y position for this one. Okay, so sometimes one gets rid of 3 errors. Let's run this again. All right, wonderful. So close, but I think this will do for right now. I don't want to spend too much time. I'll figure out why that's not quite lining up as it should, or maybe it's this one right here. Oh yeah, there you go. Okay, so as I said, that width is 481, so just go ahead and delete that. That's why. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect. So that is actually how your workflow may go in real life, is fumbling around with these. And again, hopefully it's better in 8, but I can't imagine it would be too much better. Okay, so now everything is flowing and resizing appropriately. How do we connect our text fields and our button, namely the calculate button, and our label back to the view controller? With a lot of, let's take Android for example. For Android, what we would do is we would select this object, we would give it some kind of ID, and then in code, we would write a line of code to then go and grab that ID. And if you guys are familiar with JavaScript, it was get element by ID, and you would pass it the ID that HTML element has on it. That's the way that Android works. With iOS, it's a lot simpler than this. So if we open up our view controller, and we can do this side by side. So let me actually hide the console at the bottom, Command-Shift-Y. I can go over to this button here, and I don't know if you can see it, but it is the middle button in the second group, or the group on the left-hand side, and it says Show the Assistant Editor. If you click on that, what it'll do is it'll show the file that's associated with this view controller, or I'm sorry, the view controller that's associated with this view. And here's kind of where you want to do your keyboard shortcuts. So Command-0, show you a little bit more window real estate. And I'm going to do actually Command-Option-0 to get rid of that as well, so you can see both windows. All right, so now we have our view on the left-hand side and our view controller code on the right-hand side. The easiest way to hook up a button to your code is to use kind of what we've been doing all along, Control-click from the button over to your view controller, release, and it'll pop up a little kind of window here to say, what do you want to name this button? Well, this was my principal text field, so let me type in principal text field. And I do like to name my text fields ending in the type, so that way I know it's a principal button, or it's a principal text field, or it's a principal label, that sort of thing, so you know what it's pointing back to. It'll automatically fill in the type for you. What you can do is sometimes you can make it a little bit more generic, like just UI. What's the generic of a UI button? I can't think what the parent class is, but it's a hierarchy. And then the storage, and you might be asking, well, what's weak, right? And there's a strong type. This is the association. This is kind of more of a memory management issue. Who owns this button? Well, the view controller doesn't own the button because the view was the one that created it. So this is what we call a weak relationship. And we won't get too much into it today, but just remember that usually for the most part, UI elements that are created and instantiated in this view here are not owned by the view controller. And so again, that's a weak connection. If you're maybe developing or creating buttons and other text fields dynamically in code, that would actually be a strong relationship. And this is how Xcode manages memory. And you might think that Swift is a garbage collected language. It is not. It is actually what we call an automatic reference count. And we'll get into that later class, but it actually counts the number of references of other objects to certain objects. And when that reference count equals 0, meaning nobody has a pointer to it, it throws out that memory for you automatically. And it's very, very fast. Okay, so let me just go ahead and get the references to these other text fields. So I'm going to drop this in, let's say above this guy. This one is my interest. Oops, text field. Okay, I want one for the button, and I'm going to drag the button here, but it's not going to actually be a variable. It is going to be an action. So an outlet is what we call a variable, so a reference to that UI element. Instead, we want an action, meaning when I hit that button, I want something to happen, i.e. an action, and this is just a method within our class. So I'm just going to call it calculate. The type here is the sender, so who sent this? Normally it's actually a UI button, but I'm going to keep any object. And what any object is literally any object. It's kind of the equivalent of Java's object, but it's any object. It's just saying I can pass in any object there. It could be a button, it could be a label, it could be a UI view, it could be anything. Touch up inside. That means when my finger lifts up from within inside of the button, it activates this action. Rather than me selecting it and then deciding I don't want to select that action, dragging off of it and then lifting up. We also have a touch up outside if you want to handle those instances. But just select the defaults. And this created it here. I'm actually going to move this down below our UI ViewController. Okay, and then finally we have our label. Let me add this real quick. This is going to be our, I'm just going to call it value label. So this is the value of our account after the interest has been applied to it. Okay, so let's look at the code real quick. We have what you might call an annotation. It's really not, but or maybe it is. I don't know if we call these annotations. At IB outlet. IB stands for Interface Builder, which is this thing on the left. It's just telling the code and the compiler that this variable that I have here that I've declared is declared. It exists somewhere in my view. And this is just telling Xcode things like, hey, I should show this little button here to connect it to different views like that. You can do it that way if you want. Hit escape. And it does other things as well. We're saying it's a weak relationship. Again, a little bit of memory management that we didn't talk about last class. This is a variable. This could change. We can assign the text field, this reference, to another text field within our view. We could trash it, get rid of it, create a new one, and reapply it. So that's what we want. And this is just saying that it's optional at this point. We won't get into this as well. And similar with this, and all these are type UI text fields. Okay, so let's do something interesting with this when I hit that calculate button. So when I hit calculate, I want to take the value of principal. So let, because the way we start our values or our variables with let, unless we have to change it, let principal equal principal, and we have a text field here somewhere, so autocomplete that. But we don't want the text field, we want the text within the text field, so just do .text. Okay, and that'll get us the value of that, and that'll store that in principal, but it's telling me that this is, let's see, what's the type? Oh, it's never used. Okay, well, give me a chance to use it. The next one I want to do is interest. Get rid of that. So let interest equal, and then again the interest text field, somewhere there, .text. And of course, you'll probably have to make sure that you can only enter in numbers here. There's a couple ways to do that. Let me show you one right now. So these are only going to be numbers. So select this, get over, actually we can do it here. So on our inspector on the right, select this little kind of slider back and forth little icon here. And if you go down to keyboard type, you can say that number pad only. Okay, and I'm going to do that for the interest one as well. So again, in this right-hand column, keypad, number pad. And that's one way of restricting our input to namely or only numbers. Okay, so now we pulled out the values from the principal text box and the interest text box. And what do we do with that? Obviously, we calculate those together to equal the value. So I'm going to do let value. These are actually going to be text fields. Okay, we're running out of time, so what I'm just going to do is, let's pretend that I calculated those. These are strings, and I'd have to convert them to integer or doubles or floats. So I'm just going to set this to 108. I'm going to cheat here. When I post this code after class, I'll fix this up, but we are running a little bit low on time. And if we do have time, we'll go back and fix this. Okay, so we have this value, and it's telling me I'm not actually using these values. So let me just spit these out on the console. I don't like error messages. So. Okay, so stop complaining that those are not being used. And then what I want to do is I want to take that value that I've calculated and put that into that label that we have, and that label was called value label. So value label dot text, because we're setting the text value of it, equals value. And again, hopefully you calculate that on your own. And that's what we did last class. You can refer to that code. Okay, and so when I hit calculate, it theoretically would grab the two values from those text fields, calculate them together into a third variable, and then assign that to the label. So let's give this a shot and see what happens. Okay, so here's our application. Let's say our principal is $100, and our interest rate, let's say, is 0.08. And actually, so my keyboard did not show up, and if I go to hardware and go down to keyboard, I am going to disconnect the hardware keyboard so that I can see that. So for whatever reason, it got turned off or whatever. Unselect that option, and now you can see what would happen is if I turn this on. Now with the number pad, it doesn't have a decimal point. I'd have to do another number pad option there. But let's go ahead and just hit calculate, and you can see that 108 has now replaced that label. So this is how to get inputs, do calculations, and then affect your UI widgets on the front end, namely our label here. Okay, any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Okay, so go home, do this on your own. Just throw a bunch of text fields on the screen, connect them up to your code. Again, holding down the control key or the control key, left mouse clicking, and dragging into your code using this assistant. You can do this manually if you want. Like you could actually say, I'm going to create an IB outlet here. And again, an IB outlet is kind of like you're plugging something into the wall, right? Weak var, some button here of type button, and exclamation point for the fact that it's optional. Oh, not a button, it's a UI button, excuse me. So now you can see that this circular object here is not filled in, and that's just saying that this outlet has not been connected. So you can do a number of things. You can control click on a button from this button to this object, connect it that way, or you can go the other way around. Just single left click and drag that to the button, and you'll connect those. So that's how you do your connections between your UI and your backend. And that's all I got for you today. And next class we will cover a lot more in depth. We'll start building out maps and talking about the map API, I think we get to there. And that'll prepare you for project 1. So thanks for coming out. If you guys have any questions or whatever, say after, ask questions. I'll leave the last 15 minutes for that. But otherwise, you're free to go. Thanks for coming out.